How about the Gonzalez group back there? What was your guys' main discussion point then?
We talked about a couple different things. One of them was like how the world kind of tells us to measure our lives, and that common phrase was mentioned about like life is not measured by the number of breaths you take, but the moments that take your breath away. Like that super cheesy
That
saying.
sounds like an Instagram, yeah.
Yeah. But it's kind of like the world kind of says we should measure our lives by like experiences, right?
Right.
Things that you're able to do. And then we also kind of brought up the parallel to Job, which we'll probably be talking about more, but just like how he was also discontent sometimes. It was like a healthy discontentment.
Okay.
And before he was well off, and then he went through the whole struggle, and he was even better off after it was all over. And we kind of talked about that for a little bit, but we didn't really come up with a one-word answer on how we should measure our lives.
No, that's good. I know Kate and Patsy and Nicole had some interesting comments. If I were to summarize what you guys said, that how do we measure our lives? That involves some comparison, and we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other people, right? Which is a little bit maybe what you guys were saying. Have you guys ever tried to build something, and this has happened to me once? I ordered like a new tape measure from China, and you get it, and an inch is not an inch. You ever gotten that? And so you go to cut something, and you're like, wait, okay, this says it's supposed to be 11 inches, and then you go to fit it in there, and it's short by 3 inches or something like that, or not 3 inches. It was still short, and you go back and you measure it. No, that cut right. And I gave enough room for waste, but then you actually pull out another ruler, and you look at that other ruler, and you realize like the tape measure has been printed incorrectly, and it's not measuring appropriately. And so it really matters who created the ruler or the tape measure, and that when we use society's measurement or rubric or guide, we're always going to be off, right? Does that make sense? Or maybe inches should be eliminated, coming from the lady who was born in the metric system. And from computer science and physics standpoint, I would agree with you. But and then teaching my sons how to measure stuff, yeah, I would agree with you. I'd rather tell them just to add zeros instead of divide by 12. All right. So anything else? Were the comments similar? Did you guys come up with anything radically different than that summary? No. Right, families, relationships. There's a bunch of different measuring or ways we can measure our lives. Our society tells us to measure it by what we have. I think millennial generation and younger, right? Ashley and I value travel and experiences. The Mormon faith values the number of children you have, right? There's lots of different rubrics. I get the feeling that it's not about measuring. It's not about comparing, right? Let's actually go back to some verses here. Let's talk about physical contentment. Nope. Next slide. Sorry. So physical contentment. This is what Philippians has to say. Who wrote Philippians? Paul? Right. For I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Philippians 4, 11 through 13. So we have good examples from the New Testament about Paul talking about physical contentment. Where did Paul start off? Before he walked that road to Damascus, he was a Jew of a Jew. What does a Jew of a Jew mean? He was extra Jewish. No. He was a man's man, right? If we talk about a man's man, we talk about a guy who, has a full beard, notwithstanding mine, has a full beard, like carries around an axe, has rippling muscles, has a big truck. He's a man's man, right? In Paul's day, he was the Jew of the Jews. Yeah, he was well educated, right? When he talks about who he talks about him. He was trained under Gamaliel, which was a well-known rabbi of the time. He grew up in a nice town. He was a Roman citizen, right? He had everything going for him, right? When we think about Paul, he was like the C-level executive of the day, right? He had everything for him. And then what happens? Someone give me a synopsis. He decides he's all in on this Jewish thing, and what does he do with the Christians? He persecutes them. And not just persecutes them, he's the one who holds the coats. So he says, I'm an accessory to murder. I held the coats of the people that stoned Stephen. And then he goes on the road to Tarshish, to Damascus, right? Road to Damascus, right? Sees Jesus, is blinded, has that conversion moment, and goes from, hey, I'm the Jew of the Jews, I have everything, I'm well respected, I'm well educated, to I know nothing. He starts from square one, right? In a social group that doesn't even want to trust him. So he goes from this standing of anything I say, people are going to trust, people are going to respect, people are going to listen to no one in my social group now trusts, understands, or listens to me, and God's telling me to go do this thing, go preach this gospel. And think about there's some social ramifications there, but what about his physical ramifications? If I told you, you've got a career, you've been doing it for a decade, I want you to completely set fire to your career and go do something new. What kind of ramifications would that have to your livelihood? What's that? Yeah. Major financial. Matthew, back there, you work for the Army. If you decided, okay, my passion is making pies, and not just you leave. You're working out of Gowan, right? So, Air Force, not Army, Air Force. You get court-martialed, right? You kicked out, and you're dishonorably discharged. Your future in that organization is burned to the ground. You decide, okay, I'm going to go do something different. Pies, right? You have to rethink, where am I going to live? How am I going to make money? And I think that's what Paul's getting at here, is his entire world, his relation to his God, his relation to his society, his relation to finances and money are turned on its head. And he's learned to be content. I'm not quite sure if, I would hope we could maybe come to the conclusion with more study that contentment came after being a Christian. But we might be able to make the statement that he was content before he became a Christian. But I think it would maybe warrant more study. But either way, this guy knows what it is to have much, to have little, and he can be content. What does that mean from a physical realm for us? Let's go back to discussing for 2 or 3 minutes, or let's just do some popcorn. What are things that we do, or that we need to do as Christians, to help us to be content with our physical world, with the physical world we have to live in? Yeah, Patsy. Be thankful, right? Rely on God. Okay. Encourage other people to be content.
Count your blessings. Count what you do have. You have so much already.
Yeah.
Also denying yourself, telling yourself no sometimes is going to be a healthy thing to say. I don't need that. I don't need that right now.
Yeah. And I think you look at, there's some great passages in Isaiah about what true and honest fasting are. I think the act of fasting is an intentional act of denying yourself for a different purpose. If you go look at Isaiah, I think it's 57, True and Honest Fasting talks about fasting is supposed to be a time to break chains, to deny yourself, to make sure that other people around you are taken care of, because you're denying yourself and you're making sure what you deny yourself you're giving to other people. I'd have to go back. It's in the 58? Okay. Isaiah 58. So if you want to really learn or have a good Old Testament example of what it is to deny yourself, go read Isaiah 58. Okay. Now here's where I think it gets interesting is what about contentment in the spiritual? And yeah, to me, this feels like it's a trap. Okay? Because the way I was raised, and I think to some point this is still true. I'm still struggling with how I cope with contentment when it comes to my spiritual life. And we're going to go look at a verse that brings this into question. But when I think about obedience, when I think about me striving for perfection in the image of Christ, right, I'm not content with sinning again and again and again. I'm not content with not moving closer to Christ progressively, daily, monthly, year after year. Would everybody tend to agree with that? Okay. I agree with that. I'm not saying that should change. But we read this verse. This is from 2 Corinthians. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh. This is once again Paul. A messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored God 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I'd rather boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness. So here is Paul, who we saw before say, I'm content in all situations, whether I have a lot or have a little. And then he's talking about his physical weakness. I'm not sure whether he's talking about his physical weakness or spiritual weakness, but he says here he's content with his weakness. And this is what causes me to wonder, where do I apply this idea of being discontent with my spiritual growth versus being content with my own weakness and asking God to overcome it?
I don't want to open a can of worms too much here, but
This is a discussion class. We're supposed to open cans of worms.
I've always thought that this thorn in his side, especially this verse, he talks about, I think, maybe in one other spot, but the context here, I think he's talking about his past as a persecutor.
Okay.
Because just the way that he says, this is a messenger from Satan to torment me, so I don't exalt myself as being, self-righteous Christian or something like
Right.
that. Anyways, that's just the way I read it. So I think now that he's saying he's content with his past, he's not going to let that torment him anymore. He's going to move forward. So he's not constantly saying, man, I wish I wouldn't have done that. I wish I wouldn't have done that. And being discontent about that, he's saying, okay, that happened, and I'm moving forward.
Okay. The other thing that when I think about discontentment or contentment when it comes to spiritual ideas, you ever heard someone who's on the fence about becoming baptized and like, well, wait, I need to fix this part of my life first before I get baptized. I need to fix that part of my life. And they're discontent with their current, and they don't realize that baptism, coming into the contact of God's blood, like resolves all of these things, right? And sooner or later, you have to be content coming to God in weakness, knowing that He's going to forgive you, that He's going to make you perfect, that you're going to become a new creation in Christ. Am I off base here? Rebecca, you look contemplative. If you're going to make faces like that, you're going to have to say something.
No, I don't disagree with you. I'm just on a different page altogether.
Well, what's your page?
I was thinking about priorities. One thing that came up in our discussion was measuring your life on the effect you have on other people as a
Okay.
Christian. And I think I have measured myself in that way before and still do at times, but I've come to a place now where it's more important about my priorities because, like Paul says, about
Yeah. Yeah, Zach?
Kind of tag onto that. I think we're kind of like giving the idea of contentment too much like we're involved in it. And I don't think that's what Paul's saying. Like Paul pleaded with God, like, hey, please take this away from me. And God said no. And that's when Paul found contentment. It's not something that we like have contentment when we go to God and ask him. It's like in the hard situations when God says no, or in the situations like Rebecca was saying where we're unsure, like we're content after the fact. It's not necessarily a thing that we partake of while we're coming to God. I don't think it's more so later.
All right, and we're at the end of class. I wish we could have more time to discuss this because it's not necessarily something I struggle with, but it's something I'm curious about. I'm not sure. I think there are cases on both sides, and it's something that I think we could spend a whole nother hour discussing contentment when it comes to our spiritual lives.
I think if you've got God in your life, you're always content. It's not about the stuff. It's never been about the stuff. To be truly content, if you have God in your life, you should have contentment. I think we value too much in our stuff or things around us.
Yeah.
It's not even about your families. I mean, it can be, but even Jesus said, that comes second. Put me first. If you've got God, you've got contentment. Because even when you don't have anything and you're at your weakest moment, that's when God should be in your life and God should be shown to others through you. That even in your most weakest moment, you still have God. And this is what he can do for you.
Amen. Amen. All right, that's class. We didn't even get to the how of contentment. All right, maybe for next week. Thanks, guys. I'll read you guys a book real quick. Get this out of the way. What's that? Thanks, I'm done. I'm just going to... What's that? One groovy button? Oh, yes, the one groovy button. I'm sorry. Yeah. Your humor is just sailing right over my head. All right, so if you're a parent, you've probably read Pete the Cat. I'm going to read you some Pete the Cat real quick. I read this to Finn last night, and I thought it was applicable to our class, so I changed my class last minute. Pete the Cat put on his favorite shirt with 4 big, colorful, round, groovy buttons. He loved his buttons so much he sang this song. My 4 groovy buttons, my buttons, my 4 groovy buttons. I'm not going to go through the whole book, don't worry. One of the buttons popped off and rolled away. How many buttons are left? 3. All right. Everyone's listening? 3. 4 minus 1 equals 3. Can you guys see me okay? Okay. Did Pete cry? Goodness, no. Buttons come and buttons go. He kept on singing, my 3 groovy buttons, my 3. He loses another one, he's down to 2. He loses another one, oh no, he's down to 1. He loses another one, oh no, he's down to 0. Okay. Did Pete cry? Goodness, no. Buttons come and buttons go. Pete looked down at his buttonless shirt, and what do you think he saw? His belly button, to which Bruce laughed, or Finn laughed and found his belly button. Like, hey, he's got a belly button. Yeah. And he kept on singing this song, my button, still have my belly button, my button, still have my belly button. I guess it simply goes to show that stuff will come and stuff will go, but do we cry? Goodness, no. We keep on singing, buttons come and buttons go. So, what does Pete the Cat, with buttons come and buttons go, and Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 16 have in common? Let's read that real quick. So if you would, open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 21. And if someone would read verses 1 through 7, and maybe someone else read 7 through 16. I'm going to find it on my phone real quick. So 1 Kings chapter 21.
I'll read 1 through 7.
Go for it.
Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the place of Ahab king of Samaria. And after this Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And Ahab went into his house, vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him. where he had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down in his bed and turned away his face and would eat no food. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him, Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food? And he said to her, Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, Give me your vineyard for money, or else, if it please you, I will give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. And Jezebel his wife said to him, Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.
Okay, and so starting in verse 8, so she wrote letters to Ahab in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, Proclaim a day of fasting, and seat Naboth in the prominent place among the people. But seat 2 scoundrels opposite him, and have them bring charges that he has cursed both God and the king, then take him out and stone him. Of course, we can skip this part. It's just a repeat, just like Pete the cat. What do? They do what Jezebel says. Starting in verse 10, they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. Verse 15, soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead. Then Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. So what does the story of Naboth's vineyard and Pete the cat have in common? Other than the fact that maybe Naboth is childish and Pete the cat is childish. Is there anything there? It's two sides of two different coins, or two sides of the same coin, actually. Buttons come and buttons go. And Naboth. In the story, Pete the cat versus Naboth, who is content? Pete the cat. And we would say Naboth is, what's the opposite of content? Discontent, right? No, you're right. It's like, don't I just add a dis to that word and make the opposite? Yeah, you're right. Discontent, right? I couldn't find a good example in the New Testament of someone showing to be content in the Old Testament. I can find plenty of discontents. We might maybe think Job is content, right? Think about what happened to Job. He's pretty content. He gets pretty much everything taken away from him. And I think he's frustrated. I think he's upset. We have this conversation, this conversing between Job and God. But we don't have a good example, other than Job, of someone being content. And that's what we're going to talk about today in our class. If you didn't already know, all the different characteristics of a Christian are going to be starting with a C in this class. And so this week is going to be contentment. Next slide here. So what is it? Can someone help me give me a definition of, or at least what your definition of contentment is?
Being satisfied with what you have.
Satisfied? Okay.
The opposite of discontent.
The opposite of discontent? That's right.
No worries.
No worries. Okay. Donuts or contentment? Yeah. Discontentment is not having any donuts.
I think it has to do with, it's all of those things, but it's all those things in, like, spite of potentially bad circumstances.
Okay.
Throughout all circumstances.
Being satisfied without worry, regardless of circumstance. Okay. We've kind of hit I'm looking for synonyms, and we've talked about satisfied, we've talked about no worries. What other synonyms do we typically use with contentment? Happy, yeah. At peace. That was one I was looking for. I should actually pull out my notes. All right. The class notes, one of a couple of them here. Satisfaction, peace of mind, serenity. Do you guys think of serenity as being content? No? Cheerfulness, maybe borderline. One I don't necessarily agree with is resignation. Is resignation contentment? Is your guys' reaction like, no, I don't think resignation's contentment? Okay.
That's the same connotation of
Not fighting your circumstances. Okay. But it also feels like giving up a little bit, and we don't typically look well on this idea of giving up. Or at least I don't tell my sons, just give up.
It's not like
Right.
contentment's not caring, and that's what
right? Not caring. Okay, so the inverse of that then, what is discontentment? If I'm discontent, you had to describe that other than being the opposite of contentment. Yeah, Alex? Anxious, right?
Maybe some jealousy because somebody has something that you want,
Jealousy, right?
and so they're, what's the word? I can't remember what it is. Yes, envy.
Envy, okay. What else? If someone's discontented, what kind of attitude do they have? How do they act? Not happy? Uneasy, okay. You guys don't have to raise your hands. You can shout out these answers. It's okay. We'll get to the discussion portion later.
Or childish.
Childish, right? We typically think of someone who's discontent as someone who grumbles a lot, right? Nothing's ever good enough. They always find something to complain about. That they're a fault finder, a complainer, dissatisfaction maybe. I'm not sure if I agree with dissatisfaction and discontentment, but unrest, right? Nothing's ever perfect. And then I also think, and not to make light of the situation, but people that maybe have an obsessive compulsive disorder that has to have everything perfect, they're discontent with almost every scenario, right? They're going to find fault or something they need to fix or clean, right? All right. So why do we need to talk about discontentment? Why did the author of this material, why does Clint think, Clint's not the author, but Clint chose this material. Why do we think contentment's important when it comes to Christian values?
I feel like we're always being told we need more and we need to be, that we're not content because we need more and we need to change this or change that. And, it's always something pulling at us.
Right. We're living in a culture that tells us we need more, and we'll get to that. Okay.
So I think you always need to strive for being better.
Okay. Content with what you have, but not who you are. And I kind of feel the same way. And I might be changing a little bit. We'll talk about that. Alex?
I believe that you have content with what you have, not with what you are. But I think there's a need for discontent. There's a need for it. Otherwise, you become complacent.
Okay. Okay. We're already starting to jump into that. This idea that when it comes to contentment, there's two realms. There's a physical realm in which contentment is appropriate, and I think culturally, from a church and faith perspective, we put contentment into our spiritual world as well. One of the best examples I can think of is we say our body's our temple and we want to take care of our body. But if I'm content, I don't care. I'm going to be content with my body, right? I'm going to be content putting things in my body that might not be healthy, but we're told our body is our temple, or the temple is our body. I wholly believe from a material, worldly, secular position, contentment is important. I am struggling with contentment at a spiritual side, and we're going to talk about that, and that's kind of what I want us to discuss, is to make a case for or against contentment as it pertains to spiritual aspects, and I've got a couple of verses we'll talk about. All right, here's a quote from Keith Robinson. I don't know who Keith Robinson is, but it's a good quote, so I'll read it anyway. Few, if any of us, have ever engaged in a day-to-day struggle for the necessities. It's always impossible for us to relate to the concept of physical need. Our struggle is for the superfluous. Clothing and food are the rule, not the exception. They are as natural to us as the air we breathe. Our security is threatened not by the thought of death or famine or exposure, but by something that might limit our creature comforts. Our chief preoccupation is not how we're going to provide another meal for our family, but which of the thousands of items available to us are we going to select on this particular meal. Many in America spend more in an attempt to keep their weight down than others in the world have spent to keep from starving. right? And so I think Keith's comment here highlights really why, as Christians, we need to talk about contentment, because if we were in a country that wasn't as successful and affluent and have all the resources that we have, I don't think contentment would be an issue, right? We'd just be happy that we had a meal waiting for us at home today. But right now, we get frustrated when we can't decide what restaurant we're going to go to, right? Or at least I get frustrated when my family all gets together and no one can make a decision, and it's like, does it really matter? I get to go eat a meal, and someone prepares it for me, and someone brings it to me, and I get to spend time with my family. I'm not worried about where my next meal is coming from.
There's that saying, first world problems.
Yeah. The common vernacular is first world problems, right? Okay, so that's why we need to discuss contentment. Let me make sure I'm hitting all the high points here. So let's actually talk about some Bible verses. Let's hit the Bible on what the Bible says about contentment. Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 12, 13 through 15. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." What's the Old Testament, not Old Testament, but the Hebrew rule about in inheritance? What's that? The oldest. The oldest gets a double portion. The math that I do in my head, if you have two brothers, you really divide it up as though you had three brothers, and the oldest brother gets two portions. So a family with three brothers, you had 100,000 credits or whatnot, 333,000, 333, 333,000, 333, 333,000, 333, and you pay the cat an extra one credit. One brother gets 66,666, and another brother gets 33,333. Does that make sense? And it all depends on who's the oldest. Come on, turn back on. There we go. So this person is yelling to Jesus, "Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he's saying, I don't want a third of the inheritance, assuming there's two brothers. I want half of the inheritance. Tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Then he said to them, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has abundance does his life consist of possessions." The New Living Translation says that last sentence, life is not measured by how much you own. And I think this is important. In Jesus' time, when we think of Jesus' time, we think, oh my goodness, they have to wash their feet when they enter buildings. At least when I think of Jesus' time, I think they have to wash their feet when they enter buildings. They're not commonly bathing themselves, because bathing is not a daily activity. We have people outside of Jerusalem, the Essenes, that are bathing themselves often and seen as weird, right? They're baptizing themselves. You have this practice of putting oil on our head in order to try to anoint ourselves or clean ourselves. I wouldn't think of Jesus' time as being abundant. But what does Jesus say? Jesus tells this person, you're living in an abundant time. Don't think of your life as being consistent of just your wealth. All right? So even from Jesus' perspective, at his time, he's telling the people, you live in an abundant time. Your life is not consistent of the things you own. And like I said, I like the way the New Living Translation says it. It's a little more difficult in the NASB and the NIV to suss this out. But for not even when one has abundance does his life consist of his possessions. All right. So our first point of discussion that I'd like us to talk about, and let's just try to divide up into quadrants, north, south, east, and west, or north, that corner, this corner, that corner. Let's divide up. The first discussion is if Jesus says we shouldn't be measuring our lives by our treasures, by our physical abundance, how should we be measuring our lives? I think this is going to help us frame the discussion when it comes to spiritual and physical contentment. So take a few minutes and discuss amongst yourselves. So, Meredith and Zach, go back with the Gonzalez's.